All right, welcome back to the Foundation of a Poker Player video series. This is now part 2 of video 2. And in this video I'm going to talk more specifically about the emotional level. And in the last one I talked a lot about a lot of background information that should help to remove a lot of doubt and self-criticism about how learning actually takes place, and remove a lot of the consequences that sort of come from you falling back into old patterns or falling back into some areas of weakness or weak performance or weak play, when in fact those times are actually great opportunities for you to learn exactly what it is that you can work on in that area, as well as what actually shows up is stuff that you don't need to be working on. So with regards to emotion, I'm going to be talking a lot about how emotion relates to performance or is unrelated to performance, as well as information about the zone, and actually quantify and really narrow down a specific definition as to what the zone is, and tell you why it's important. I'm also going to be talking a lot about the role of emotion in memory. In that last video I talked a lot about the role of the Iowa gambling study and understanding how emotion kind of produces a hunch as you're kind of gathering data, gathering information. But in the same respect, emotion is also necessary in order to move information down from the conscious competency stage down into the unconscious competency stage. And how that happens I'll get to. The emotional system is actually really quite old. Another name for it is the limbic system. That's the more technical name. And the limbic system is around 300 million years old. I mean, it's just estimates at this point, but we actually share a lot of the structures of the emotional system with animals, even reptiles. I mean, snakes have very similar structures to us. The thing that animals lack, though, is they lack a cognitive capacity to be self-reflective about our own emotional state. Instead, animals are more reactive. They sense danger, they react to it. They sense anxiety, they react to it. They're happy, they react. I mean, they are unable to think and process in a more reflective way. And, dogs, they can't go to therapy. I mean, they have Prozac now, and there's Doga, which I heard the other day is doggy yoga. But, there are two things that our cognitive capacity actually provides us. One, it gives us the ability to know exactly what we're feeling and make decisions on how we're feeling. Well, now, there are sort of two sides of that coin. I mean, that's either a positive or a negative. Certainly the positive allows us to be selectively adaptive. We can gravitate towards what makes us feel good, but oftentimes doing that exclusively can lead to problems. As well as, if we think specific to poker, right? If you are making a decision on what limit to play based on your emotions, maybe you're not feeling too great today, and so you decide not to play at a higher limit, so you play at lower limits. And is that always the best decision? Maybe, maybe not. And conversely, if you're feeling great and you're real confident about your game, do you decide to play at higher limits? And is that always the right decision? And I'm not saying one way or the other, but in this video I'm going to provide you a lot of information as to exactly maybe how to make some better, clearer decisions about that. Well, and the other thing that this cognitive capacity does is actually adds layers of emotion. Think about this. If you're feeling doubtful about a given situation, well then, are you more likely to actually doubt and add more doubt to that because you're aware that you're doubting? And so if that continues to happen over a period of time, you will actually start to develop doubt about a specific situation before you even should feel doubt about it. Or in situations when you shouldn't feel doubt because you actually have the ability to perform, but because you've learned over time and added these layers of doubt, doubt shows up. Why? You trained it. Thinking, at that point you were consciously incompetent about doubt. Well, over time you became consciously competent about why you should doubt in those situations, potentially even to the point where you've become quite skilled at doubting in those moments. And so emotion can at times feel completely disproportionate to the situation. And that is actually quite real, and that's one way that happens. And so to begin today, I'm going to be talking more specifically about emotion as it relates to memory. So since we're talking about emotion, I feel like I need to take a little bit of the connotation away from this whole topic, because certainly in the American culture, and especially among men, I can't speak for other cultures around the world, but it's not generally accepted and certainly not encouraged to a large degree, at least not when I was growing up, to really be in touch with your emotions, to know how you're feeling, to know how others are feeling, and to be able to respond appropriately based on that information. And that's not to say that I'm going to ask you to sort of get all touchy-feely here, but let's be a little bit clear about the role of emotion and what exactly we're talking about. I mean, really, emotion is just feeling. It's an internal state. Now, how you know that, it developed over time, and you created these memories and these associations with this particular internal state with that name. And so we call it anger, we call it sadness, anxiety, fear, happiness, joy, contempt, you name it. Those are all examples of emotions, and so we've sort of associated this internal state with that emotion. Well, memory is critical in this, because without memory you could never really have a name for your emotion. You could certainly know what you're feeling, but you would forget soon after. Think 10-Second Tom from 50 First Dates, or any person with amnesia has very transient experience, because we are literally tied to our emotion, to our memory. Memory is really how we come to define our experience, and at this point, there really are no truly new experiences. Not to get too esoteric here for a moment, but really any situation that you walk into in your life at this point, you're bringing in with these built-in assumptions and expectations, and that's very relevant for your poker play, because the memory system is very much tied into the emotional system. And in fact, what's called long-term memory, which is different from that automatic processing, is actually part of the limbic system, part of the emotional system, and they're very much interrelated. And so the long-term memory system is designed to accumulate information, to hold this emotionally coded experience, because as we think back to the Iowa gambling study, over time, right, you developed a hunch based on what was happening in the environment, and that hunch is emotionally based. It's you're sensing it at an emotional level. It's a feeling, right? And so you get that because you have a certain amount of evidence. It doesn't happen right away. Just like the guy in the mailroom doesn't run up to the CEO's office with one piece of information. You only it only becomes emotional after you've got some experience with it. And similarly, you only know it cognitively after you've got some information. And so this idea of accumulation is directly relevant, and I'll talk more about it when we get to performance. But you think about when you're running bad, or when you're running really well, or your frustration builds and then you tilt, or anxiety builds and then you have performance anxiety and are highly unsuccessful in that moment. Any number of situations where emotion builds and then has a consequence and direct effect on your ability to perform, much of that has to do with the accumulation of emotion. And again, I'll talk more about that. The other thing is prediction. The memory system is, as I said, designed to predict what's going to be happening in the environment, because at this point, if it's become emotional, you've got enough experience and enough evidence to sort of say, this is probably going to happen. But it doesn't always happen. But because it's designed to gather information and gather more information about what your intent is, certainly the Iowa gambling study is a very, very basic scenario of how this prediction happens. But look, whether or not you're predicting it cognitively, at that point, as indicated in that study, your behavior has already changed. Your emotions are sort of merely recognizing that your behavior has changed, and you're responding in a somewhat of an appropriate way, not to 100%. That's where the unconscious competency comes in, and that's where the memory system sort of takes that information, you become conscious of it, and then you can start to work it down the system again, being consciously competent about what you now know. In a way, you are sort of competent about responding to that moment in the Iowa gambling study, but more qualitatively for all of you, the consequences of not being aware of your behaviors basically mean that you have no direct control over mediating some of the ones that are not effective. And certainly all of you, to a certain degree, have areas of your own mental abilities that are not highly effective. Now, the other thing is that this long-term memory is sort of consequential or important because it's fluid, meaning that they're sort of constantly changing and adapting to the information that's being brought in. And so before you become consciously, cognitively aware of something, it can sort of be influenced by a number of factors, because if you are not allowing certain information to be coming up, and certainly I was certainly trained, and many of you have been trained, to keep your emotions at bay. Well, your emotions are carrying that information. That's sort of the purpose of it. And, emotion is a direct reflection of the interaction of your context and your neurophysiology, what's trained at that unconscious competency stage. And so, for example, to describe more about this fluidity, eyewitness testimony. Eyewitness testimony is actually quite fickle, meaning that it's not 100% verifiable, and it's not something that is often used solely to prove a particular person to be guilty of a crime. And that's partially because unless that person has actively written down with specific detail as to the incident that they just saw, over a period of time that memory can actually change and become and have some inaccuracies. And certainly if you think back to your own experience, that probably is true. And I'm sure there's been situations where you and a group of other people witnessed a situation, and then maybe you talked even a day, 2, 3 days later, weeks later, months later. You all have certain different perceptions of that specific incident. Well, if you are all purely objective in that moment, you would walk away and have exactly the same description. But the interaction between who you are, your perceptions, and certainly the way you talk about that memory or that experience over time can sort of shape and manipulate it. And that's not to say that it's solely inaccurate, but I think a lot of people make decisions about how they're feeling, and they believe that what they know to be true in terms of their memory is solid, like it's unchanging. Remember, neurophysiology, what's trained at the unconscious competency stage, is solid. It's a solid foundation. But thinking that what's in that conscious competency stage is solid would be the same as if you were standing on a surfboard in the middle of a lake and believing that you're standing on dry ground. You're continuing to maneuver, and if you believe that you're solid, you're going to lead yourself to mistakes. How that shows up at the poker table? Well, think of it this way. If you are making a decision about what limit to play, or making a decision about a particular hand, and the skill that you're basing that decision on is not trained at the unconscious competency stage, well then, but you believe that it is, well, in moments of high stress, as you know, and as we'll find out more, the emotional system actually can shut off that bit of information. It's not solid. And so to get into more of this, I want to talk a little bit more about how people make emotionally based decisions. Okay, keeping with the metaphor of you standing on a surfboard in the middle of a lake and believing that you're actually on solid ground, let's look at the idea of emotionally based decisions, because a lot of you make decisions believing that you are on solid ground, that your emotions are just. They're not. That's why they're emotional. That's the whole point of all this. We know that what is most solid exists at the unconscious competency stage. Period. End of story. Now, whether or not you actually have emotional competence that has been trained at that level, well, that's no longer an emotionally based decision. That was your emotions guiding you to a particular competence about yourself. Or poker. Your poker skill that is trained at the unconscious competency stage is untouchable. It is what's stable. And so if your decisions are influenced by more of the happenstance of the more happenstance that exists at the table, then you are really not emotionally stable. Except that, look, we're going to still talk about emotional stability as an ideal, but the fluctuations in the decisions that end up happening because you believe that your that the basis of a decision that has a strong emotional component is solid is completely irrational. And let me say this with an example here. Confidence, the idea of confidence, often becomes a support or like evidence for an emotionally based decision. Now, we know that confidence comes from competence. Okay? People who are confident that have no ability are delusional. And some of you may fall into that category. And, if I'm breaking your delusions here, I apologize, and it's going to be a little bit messy. But you can also use denial and pretend this conversation never happened, and you'll be fine. Or at least in your mind you will. But confidence is something that's necessary for you to be able to... confidence is a reflection of competence. And if you are underconfident, then you believe that your competence, what's trained at unconscious competence, doesn't exist, when that's not true. And so, if that's actually true, then the decisions that you make because you're not confident are actually inaccurate. How often does that happen? In the same way, if you are overconfident, then you are misrepresenting what is at the unconscious competency stage. You believe that there's more down there when there's not. And so that decision becomes sort of groundless and a little bit it leaves you open for a lot of things to go wrong. So either being overconfident or underconfident leads to problems. And that's an example of emotionally based decision. And you can think about this as a bigger picture. What you may start to believe about your abilities as a poker player. The more you lose confidence, the more you start to predict in the future how long that problem is going to last. And conversely, if you're becoming overconfident, then all you project in the future is that you're going to just be running well for endlessly. But both of those are not true. And if we go back to the bell curve, as I said in the last video, the only thing that we know at some point in time when you're running well is that you're going to run poorly. And when you're running poorly, the only thing we know for certain is that at some point in time you're going to be running well again. There's a cycle, and if you are detached from the idea that variance is not part of this, then you're making gross mistakes. Not to mention that from a mental and a cognitive ability, look, there is variation. There is that cycle between you working on your weaknesses and working on your competence. And that it becomes a competence in itself, understanding that as the process. And so I think it will be really helpful now to kind of get into a little bit more about how emotions specifically relate to performance. Because as we're saying right now, really confidence, or what I would call the more ideal emotional states in the long run, this may not be where you are right now, but in the long run, merely says that emotional stability, what is emotional stability really? It allows you to put into play and actually gain experience using the skills that you've identified or that are at the conscious competency stage. You're still working on them. And in order for you to really become competent, you have to be able to execute that particular play or skill in reality, in the context that you want it to. Whether that means at a particular limit, the size of a particular pot, whatever these situations are that are quite challenging for you emotionally, your emotions have to be stable enough for you to be able to execute on what you know. And if you don't know how to execute in that moment, then you have to gain more skill, and that has nothing to do with any of the work that I'm doing or helping you to do. So emotional stability merely means that it provides you with sort of the clarity to execute the skill that you know or the skill that you're working on. And if you don't execute on it, well then, and you are emotionally stable, well then you need more work on that, and that's something you can do away from the poker table. Or maybe you forgot, which means that you still need to work on it more. But if you execute on it and you gain that experience, that's the only way that you can know that you are competent in that particular context. And that delineation, that differentiation between playing and practicing, or talking with friends, or talking with other professionals or players, Just because you know what the right play is does not mean that you can execute it in all different scenarios that happen at the poker table. It is highly complex, all the differentiation, and I've been really blown away by how complex poker actually can be. But on some levels, it's really quite simple. You have to have experience utilizing that particular play. Now, you may have confidence that that particular play is correct, as well as confidence in your ability to be able to execute on it, but that in and of itself, having that confidence, does not mean you can do it. You have to have experience. And over time, you need to build up enough experience in order for that to be trained at the unconscious competency stage. So let's talk more about emotions and performance. Okay, so now we're getting into some of the meat here and this application of how emotions are relevant at the poker table when things matter. Now, actually, they do matter off the table too, but I'm going to focus specifically here to performance. And since we know that in order to become competent at a particular skill, you have to be able to execute that skill when it matters in the context in which you're trying to execute it in, at a higher limit, in higher pots, whatever the situations are specific to you. Now, this curve may help to organize a little bit of your understanding as to how emotions play a role. Now, as you know, cognitive function, all right, self-control, rational thought, perception of self and others, your ability to organize, plan, and execution in planning, and mental processing are all cognitive functions. Now, all of those functions can become trained at the unconscious competency level, in which case emotions don't play a role. But when we talked about that, the emotional brain being 300 million years old, well, one of the things that are in there, and some of you may call it the fight or flight mechanism, really that is just a description for the emotional process that shuts off cognitive function. It also prevents your ability to retain things in long-term memory, as well as be able to recall and utilize what's in long-term memory. It's a survival mechanism, and it's designed because thinking is quite slow, as we talked about. Emotions are reactive, neurophysiology really fast. And so in situations, millions of years ago, animals, including ourselves, needed to be able to react and respond to danger quickly. Now, we live in a society and a world that is far different from that, but psychological danger, psychological threats, and we can I'll go into more specifically what those mean, but they still trigger this emotional system in the exact same way, and we can see it represented here. So as emotions increase, okay, we actually need emotion to perform, and so performance increases as well, and the zone is actually in this position here, and I'll get to that more later. But as emotions continue to increase, your performance drops. Okay? Now, why does that happen? Well, it happens because your ability to mentally process things, perceive others at the table, control things, control yourself, diminishes significantly. And those are all things that are ideal and necessary in order for you to perform effectively in poker. So, how does this sort of play into that idea of accumulated emotion? Well, at any given point in time, whether it be from overconfidence or underconfidence or running poorly or even running well, there are emotions all attached to that. And so at any given point in time, you may actually start out sort of in maybe here. And if anything sort of tips you over the edge, well then all of a sudden cognitive function is going to decrease in direct proportion to the level of emotion that you've gone past this point right here, which is your threshold. This is the point at which that emotional trigger, the fight or flight, whatever you want to call it, clicks in and starts to shut down all of these functions. Now, when you think performance anxiety, when you think tilt, when you think overthinking actually, I mean, those are responses at the emotional level that shuts off these things. And I'm going to get into some strategies to sort of help to keep you on this side of the coin, because at this point, if you lose these functions and they have not been trained at the unconscious competency stage, you are in significant danger, specifically monetarily, but also emotionally. I mean, you can think about the direct consequences that experiencing this level of performance has on your confidence overall. And as I talked before about how emotions can add layers to emotions, well, if you're angry here because of what's happening at the table, you may become angry at yourself for having that happen. And really, at this point, I think this is all relevant because you need to understand that trying at that point to be able to do any of these things gets harder. It's not for any personal defect. It has to do literally that you're fighting evolution. And this is not something, this is non-negotiable. This is proven fact. It's been around for a long time. Okay? And so my advice is understand what it is that you're capable of and what you are at other points in time. And certainly in here, I mean, the zone is, as I said, sort of the panacea, the holy grail of performance. And I'll talk more about the zone in a minute, but you also don't want to be under. You don't want to have too little emotion. And psychologically speaking, we're talking about arousal or stress level. I mean, if you were to wake up on the beach after being on a vacation for 2 weeks and somebody sticks a computer in front of you and says, "Hey, log on and start playing," well, you're not going to perform very well. It's going to take you a little bit of time to sort of work your way out of it, which is why, after a vacation, it's often hard to sort of get yourself back because you've got to increase your stress level. But again, decreasing your emotions is necessary because you don't want all that accumulated emotion to just quickly throw you over the edge. And so, what do a lot of you do now? Well, you go for a walk. Exercise is actually one of the best things that you can do for yourself. So whether it's walking, but really, you got to get your heart rate up, and obviously check with your doctor to make sure that you are physically capable of exercising with a high heart rate. But aerobic exercise is one of the greatest things for decreasing stress, and there's a lot of reasons for it which we don't need to get into, but highly recommend doing it. Reducing emotion is something that I'll get to more later, but I just need you to understand that, look, if you are starting out at a point in time where your emotions have already accumulated to a level where, you're going to get thrown over the edge very easily. And again, running well can actually do that. It sets you up for failure because when you're running well, there's really only one place you can start to go if it does turn, and that's downward. And that's not a negative, but that's a reality. Okay, so the zone. The zone is really an ideal for a number of reasons, and one of which is the zone is what I call a place of high integration. What I mean by that is you're trying to train these particular skills, and if you have the skill, then you're going to gain extraordinarily valuable experiential knowledge, being able to execute those particular skills in a wide range of contexts because you're playing in the zone. Now, the zone, if we were to look at this emotional scale as a scale of 1 to 100, on average, we're going to call 50 as your threshold, okay? Which meaning that if you're at 50, you're sort of teetering on going over the edge. In which case, at that point, cognitive functions start to decrease. But when you're in the range of say 42 to 47, and again, it differs for everybody, but you need to have a lot of emotion. You need to have a lot of arousal and stress to perform well. You think about athletes who perform extraordinarily well under extreme pressure. Well, their perception of pressure is what sort of defines their ability to be in the zone because their management of the situation allows them to stay within an ideal emotional state. They don't get kicked over, and they don't lose emotion, and they don't lose that arousal. And the descriptions, range. You're performing well. Certainly if you're in the zone, you're performing well. Things come very easy to you. You're focused on the task. If you're focused anywhere else, you're not in the zone. And certainly timeless. Certainly the idea that time can sort of fly by very quickly is an often way of describing the zone. Quantitatively, the zone is really a balance between your skill set at the unconscious competency stage with your emotion being sort of stable enough where things that are in long-term memory, that conscious competency stage, can be utilized as well, and your mind is very free and open to be able to interpret what's happening in the situation. So there's a balance between skill set and context that and motivation and emotion that sort of come together and create the zone. And there is a very fine balance in there, because if your emotions are triggered and go across the edge, well, then you're done. You're out of the zone. And if they go too low, if you become bored, then you're done as well. And so I'm going to get to some strategies, not only to how you can sort of work towards playing in the zone more, but how you can start to manage your emotions better as well. All right, one more thing about this emotion and performance deal before we move on, and that's that there really is no ideal emotion for you right now in terms of what's going to put you into that zone range, in terms of an ideal mindset for playing, an ideal emotional state for playing, because really it has to do with that emotional level that's key, whether it's anger or stress, fear, happiness, enjoyment, whatever is going to put you into that zone around 43 to 47. Again, that's more theoretical, but you've got to find that spot for yourself. Whatever is going to put you into that zone, I could care less at this point what gets you there. The bottom line is you got to get in there and get playing at that level, because that's where you're going to be able to have high integration and train those skills really well. Now, in the long term, there are some ideals that exist, but that's going to take work, and at this point, better to be performing well and making money than, working just towards some ideal in the future. So just keep in mind that what kicks you into the zone can change from day to day, because you're sort of balancing out and moving forward. Things do not stay static. They don't stay constant. So someday it might be anger, another day it might be fear, but again, being aware of your emotional state at any given point in time along that spectrum as it relates to your performance is key. And so that is strategy number one, awareness. And one strategy to become more aware involves triggers and tendencies. All of this stuff, the things that happen to you at the table, the things that cause your emotions to rise at the table, we're going to call triggers. And the way that you know that you are experiencing a given emotion, other than your ability to recognize that state internally, has to do with tendencies. These are the things that you do, the things that you think. Maybe your heart rate increases, your breathing changes, you start to sweat, maybe you pace, maybe you swear, maybe you start thinking about something constantly over and over again, maybe you call yourself some less than favorable names. Any of those things are tendencies. These are things that happen given your emotional state. And so you can do that for the dominant emotions that cause the most problems for you at the table, whether it's anger, fear, elation, or some variation of a combination of those is necessary for you to be able to know when to manage the emotion at the table. Right? You've got to recognize it before you can know to manage it. And all of that can become a unconscious competency if you train it and work on it. Now, the triggers are key because you want to be able to know what to look for. And the tendencies are key because if you've already been triggered, then you've got to be able to take direct action. But knowing your triggers is sort of like the first line of defense. These are the things that cause your emotions to rise. I think one that I've seen most significantly for most of you has to do with results and variance. You expect certain things to happen based on expected value, but you also may not fully accept the variance that comes with poker. And the way that emotions can sort of convolute and sort of cloud that whole scenario is that sometimes emotion can cause poor performance. And if that's true, how does that really relate to your ability to know that your skills are just? Are they good enough? Well, it's hard to know if emotion's present. So, in this whole deal, we're trying to move away from emotion as being a factor. Because if emotion's not a factor, then all that's left is skill. And then you know for certain whether or not the results that you're seeing have to do with your skill or variance. And if you're in that place, then you know how to then you know what the deal is. And if your skills aren't good enough, then you go work on them. So examples of triggers, that can be a bad read, a stupid mistake, a bad beat. I mean, any number of things that you identify that increase your stress, emotion, that cause you to cross that threshold is critical, because this is something. I mean, the threshold piece, you crossing that line where your cognitive capacity diminishes, is significant. I mean, this is a non-negotiable. Okay. In order for you to prevent tilt, prevent performance anxiety, prevent overconfidence from significantly impacting your results in a negative way, I mean, causing you all sorts of headaches, is to stay on the left side, to stay below your threshold. If you prevent that, I mean, you are in phenomenal shape. Now, certainly you don't want to be too low either, and so there's a balance, but if you never cross that threshold, you will always have the ability to easily access your cognitive capacity. And from there, you can manage things quite a lot easier. Okay, so since accumulated emotion is part of this whole deal, and when triggers happen, right now in the moment, they also often carry emotion that's built up over a period of time. And so I'm going to be releasing a video that deals specifically with a strategy called systematic desensitization that can literally start to undercut and reduce that accumulated emotion. But in the interim, I think a strategy that can be really effective is evaluating your results after you play, after a session is over. And I would say 9 times out of 10, your tendency is going to be, if the results are really good or really poorly, that you're going to avoid analyzing results afterwards, when those are exactly the times when you should be analyzing. Because, again, you're trying to achieve some emotional consistency, and if you leave the table and come back with expectations from either of those 2 points, then you're more likely to get tripped up the next time you show up. You haven't really let go of that emotion. And one way that you can start to let go is by evaluating and sort of just processing the results as you saw them, both qualitatively in terms of emotion, in terms of your ability to manage yourself. Did the strategy that you entered that session with hold up? Did it work? And if not, what sort of ways can you start to change and adapt that strategy to manage your emotions better? Look, at this point in time, you don't have all the answers, and nor would I ever expect you to. And you may not have all the answers in 6 months, but if you're moving in that direction, you're certainly going to improve your ability to manage yourself, and over time, that competency is going to get better and better, and this process or cycle of evaluating and reflecting in terms of being able to better direct a strategy, you're going to get better and better at doing that. But the more you avoid looking at results that are either too good or unfavorable, the more you avoid that, just like we talked about with the Iowa gambling study, the emotion sort of contains information because your behaviors already represented that. And your emotions can be a way to understand that, look, there's valuable information here. And if you allow that to accumulate, then you're essentially backing up the system and holding that information at bay. It also prevents you from taking on new information. I mean, long-term memory, this storage container is somewhat finite. And you do not have this endless supply. And so you need to be evaluating and processing the data that's in there so you can take on more. And that frees up emotional space, and it frees up mental space. Now, another thing that I think is critical, that goes along these lines, are just note-taking in general. Note-taking is critical because as we're looking at the fluidity of memory, as I talked about before, well, when you take notes, that gives you a specific point in time. It gives you a reference point for you to look back upon to have a better perspective in the future. One, you can identify any changes that have taken place, which gives you confidence that your competence in being able to move yourself forward is happening. And two, it allows you to sort of see, it gives you a way to reflect back on what did actually work and what didn't work. And what didn't work, you toss out, and what did work, you reinforce and do more of that. And that, again, is going to make you better. So when you're looking back and reflecting on these triggers and tendencies, this spectrum analysis from 1 to 100, where 100 is the most stress that you can imagine, and you're identifying triggers and tendencies that exist all along that way, the real key thing is threshold. And I can't say it enough, because you do not get to negotiate with evolution. Evolution says when emotions cross threshold, cognitive capacity diminishes. And so managing and preventing yourself from going across threshold is critical. And so what I suggest is that you really focus on a few triggers and tendencies that are most significant, that stand out to you most, and really work to manage those. Track them during the midst of play, but do not reflect too actively on them. You don't want to really be actively learning in the middle of playing. You just want to be reactive. The learning process, the active learning process, takes place afterwards. Okay? Because when you're in performance mode, you really want to be very present to what's happening. And you can make it subtle adjustments, and you allow your emotions to be sort of the guide to what adjustments you make. But in order to do that really successfully and to know that you're doing it accurately, you have to have a strategy that you've predetermined as to what to do when this happens. I know I'm being a little bit vague here, but I think as I said in the outset, not of this video, of my work here, that there are so many variations to how what I'm talking about applies specifically to you. And so, in a way, I'm asking for this information to sort of trigger you. And what I mean by that is that just see where this information takes you and come back and review it after a week or two of doing it. The same way that we're talking about point-in-time perspective, well, you're going to have a different perspective on this video in a couple weeks. And so reviewing portions of it, I think, would be really valuable for you, because you're going to see how your understanding of this information is going to change. And if you're doing the work, you're going to better understand exactly what I mean at this in 2 weeks. And so I'm going to leave you with that for now. I wish you all very well, and you'll be hearing again from me soon.